Today on Teach Me How to Vegan.
And so, fish oil has been touted as kind of a miracle drug, or in this case, a miracle nutrient, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it equates with better health or that we can't get these nutrients in other places, right? Anyway, what these studies found, although so many Americans, because of what they hear, go to their doctor and say, hey, doctor, I need to be on fish oil, or even a doctor will recommend, hey, you need to get on a fish oil to help with, your heart, or even I went to a doctor one time because I was having, joint pain or something, knee pain on my bicycle. And he said, oh, you got to get on a fish oil supplement right away. Like that was going to be some miracle cure for the knee pain that I was suffering, And so anyway, these studies, what they show in a minute.
Welcome to Teach Me How to Vegan,
a podcast where we explore how to switch to a vegan diet.
I'm Tony, a health educator, fitness instructor, and plant-based eating program manager for Animal Protection of New Mexico.
I'm Mickey, a stay-at-home homeschooling mom and vegan cook who likes to play in the kitchen.
Our family stopped eating meat in 2007.
And we went vegan in 2016. Now we like to share with others what we've learned.
Thanks for joining us.
Let's get started.
Today, once again, we have joining us the wonderful Gabrielle Garden, registered dietitian. Thank you so much for being here with us today and joining us, Gabrielle. Always love to have you.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me, Tony. Sorry, I was just toggling between different screens.
I'm actually excited for this conversation because this is another one that the last episode we did was the calcium episode, right? And then previously we did an episode all about plant milks, talking about which ones we like, which ones we like to bake with, et cetera, et cetera. And I kind of went on a rant about calcium and how I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the whole calcium thing because there's just so much misinformation out there. Anyway, I bring that up because today we're talking about omega-3s, and omega-3s is another one that I feel like I can't talk about enough just to try and wrap my mind around it. And, once I feel like I understand it, if I stop thinking about it for a month, then I already, I have to brush up on it again because there's so much there. So we're going to try and simplify it a little bit just because I think omega-3s is one of those things that people might get concerned about when they're going vegan, especially in the beginning. We tend to think about what am I going to need to focus on, or are there things I'm going to need to focus on a little bit more? The main culprits being protein, calcium, which we've already talked about, and omega-3s. So just getting into it, just from the beginning, for somebody who's a really beginner, what actually is omega-3s? It's kind of commonplace word that people say a lot. You hear it a lot in headlines and, nutritional facts and, products that boast about the health benefits. But what actually are omega-3s?
Great question, Tony. Yeah, man. Like you say, let's go back to the beginning, man. Let's go to the beginning of time, brother. No, just kidding. We're not going to go that far back. Like you say, these terms get thrown around, right? Different kinds of diets, different kinds of nutrients like omega-3s. But number one, let me just say, because we talk a lot about whole foods, and if anybody's ever heard me talk before, they hear me talk about whole food plant-based, and I'm sure they've heard you say that term a million times too. Right. And that's what we need to be concentrating more on in nutrition is whole foods, right? If we're eating whole foods, a variety of whole foods, if it's predominantly or exclusively plant-based, we're not going to have to worry as much about the individual nutrients, something that we call reductionism. We're trying to reduce a broad topic like nutrition down to these little tiny parts, like individual nutrients, omega-3s, calcium, different types of proteins, the protein building blocks like amino acids, right? Talking about things like branch chain amino acids. So people will freak out about branch chains because it's like, oh, I can't build muscle without branch chain amino acids, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, oh, I'm not going to have good heart health or whatever else they think is associated with omega-3s. So generally speaking, I think people know omega-3s are associated with cardiovascular health or better heart health. But on a basic level, omega-3s, yes, they're fatty acids, and they're long chain fatty acids specifically. And there's different types. And so generally speaking, you've got the alpha linolenic acid. That is a long chain or a medium chain, one of the two, I can't remember exactly. Fatty acid that's found in foods like algae. And of course, that's where the fish get their omega-3s from as well, algae. And so you can get an omega-3 supplement from algae rather than getting it from fish oil. We can talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, perhaps. And then, of course, different kinds of nuts and seeds. And then there's other foods too, that you can find omega-3s in, but in small amounts, or at least alpha-linolenic acid, which generally speaking, I think we call it an omega-3. It's kind of most specifically an omega-3 precursor. And we'll talk more about that too here in just a moment. And so think about walnuts. That's the best nut source of alpha-linolenic acid, ALA. And then flaxseed and chia seed and hemp seed are wonderful sources of ALA as well. And foods that we commonly find in plants. And then of course you can get it in fish too. But like I say, cut out the middle fish, because there's a lot of other issues associated with fish. PCBs, through these toxic chemicals, heavy metals, saturated fat. Yes, fish has the healthier kinds of fat like omega-3s, but if you compare it to eating nuts and seeds and greens and beans, right, foods that all have varying amounts of fats, but predominantly all mono and polyunsaturated fats, fish still has a lot more saturated fat than do all of these plant-based foods. And saturated fat, we know there's some people that want to say butter is back. It's not. Saturated fat is not back. There's more data in the scientific nutrition world, pretty much than any other topic, to demonstrate that saturated fat raises our LDL cholesterol, which is our harmful or bad cholesterol, that then, of course, results in a higher risk for heart disease and dying from things like heart attack and stroke. And so we want to keep our LDL cholesterol down, and the most effective way to do that is to bring down the saturated fat in our diet. So why go to fish for omega-3s, which are much higher in saturated fat? These other toxins and pollutants in them, because these things bioaccumulate in the insides of animals like fish or cows or us. Whenever we eat lots of different foods, we accumulate these toxins in our tissues. Just go straight to the plants. There's much lower levels of any toxin if you go straight to the plant, rather than going through the middleman or the middle fish in this case, right, to get our nutrients. So plants are safer, healthier sources for these nutrients. And like I say, the fish is getting its omega-3s from the algae anyway. So like in my case, I take a supplement called Complement. Just got a few things in it because I don't want to take a lot of stuff that I don't need, right? Just a few things that may not be in abundance in a plant and an otherwise really healthy, varied plant-based diet. But it's just got a few things like those omega-3s and, the vitamin D, which is an important nutrient for omnivores and vegans, vegetarians, whoever. A lot of people ought to think about taking vitamin D. And what's the other big one? B12. B12 is something that's essential on a plant-based diet, vegan diet. You should be taking a B12 supplement. Full stop. Just don't even worry about it. It's cheap, it's easy, it's effective. It's been proven through lots of research. Take a B12 supplement, you keep healthy B12 levels, and you don't have anything to worry about. So let's break down real quick. I talked about ALA being a precursor. So then in the body, there's activated forms then of omega-3s in the body, the long chain omega-3 fatty acids. And those are the things that actually have a direct impact on the health of our brains. And when we're thinking about our brain, we're thinking predominantly about DHA, hexanoic acid, something like that. But anyway, DHA. And then EPA is the other long chain activated form of omega-3, and that's pentanoic acid, more or less. But anyway, people can just look those up. EPA and DHA. And the EPA is more closely related to our cardiovascular health. So the health of our blood vessels, our vascular system. And again, we can convert ALA to EPA and DHA. But the rate at which that's done, it's a pretty slow process in the body, but we don't need a ton of DHA and EPA. That being said, I've seen some studies in older adults, like many other things that happen throughout life. Our bodies tend to work maybe a little bit less efficient, right? Or a little bit more slowly as we age and with certain processes. And so in certain older adults, they may convert the ALA in things like chia seeds or walnuts or dark leafy greens, which have some ALA in them as well. When you're getting all that ALA in your diet from these healthy whole plant foods, they may convert it with a little bit less efficiency. And so it may be a good idea, especially for older adults, to supplement a DHA and EPA omega-3, supplement. And I do anyway, just as an insurance policy. I think really we need more data at this point to demonstrate whether all people, should be taking a supplement, to make sure that you're basically like topping up, taking out an insurance policy and saying, I'm making sure, so that I know with, much more confidence that my body's getting all the DHA and EPA that it needs. But that being said, in most healthy people, and in most people that aren't older adults, right, I think we don't have enough data yet to demonstrate whether everybody should be taking a DHA and EPA supplement, right? And that's vegans and omnivores alike, whether you're getting it from a fish oil supplement, or whether what I recommend, again, a safer source, a healthier source, is going to be an algae-based omega-3 DHA EPA supplement, right? But that gives people a few of the basics. Like I say, we have to convert ALA to DHA and EPA. And there's a number of factors that can influence that. I think one of them being if we get too much omega-6 in our diet, and I know we're going to get a little bit more into omega-6 in a minute, but I believe that if we get too much omega-6 in our diet, that's another essential fatty acid. It's important to know that omega-3s and omega-6s are essential. And the word essential means we have to get it exogenously, or it means we have to get it through food. We have to get it through an outside environment, right? Other nutrients we can convert, just from other compounds and other ingredients, or other, chemicals and everything, other substances that we have in our body. We can break them down and we can manufacture certain nutrients or certain compounds that we need in our body endogenously. Endogenously meaning it happens inside of our own bodies. But there's certain nutrients that have to come from the outside world. And the essential fatty acids are those, right? So like monounsaturated fatty acids, they're not essential, like omega-6 and omega-3. Now that doesn't mean it's bad to get some monounsaturated fats in our diet. That just means they're not essential. The essential fatty acids are the ones that we have to make sure to get, because our bodies can't manufacture them on their own.
I'm glad you brought up all of this, because I feel like there's three main omega-3s that are always talked about, probably because they're the most important, right? The ALA, the EPA, the DHA. And I've always tried to wrap my mind around why fish oil seems like it's the go-to versus algae oil, because like you say, cut out the middle fish. I can never wrap my mind around it. And so in preparing for this episode, I thought maybe let me read a couple articles on some sort of more popular websites. So if you just do a Google search, what are the things that Google's pulling up first? And it's your Healthline, your WebMD, just more like general sites like that. And they're talking a lot about this conversion rates, and it seems like there's a lot of concern out there about whether or not our bodies can efficiently convert the ALA to the DHA and EPA. And I think that's where the concern comes in, because when you take the fish oil, the fish have already converted it, right? So you're maybe theoretically getting more DHA or EPA. But then I went and looked at the algae oil supplement that I have in my refrigerator, and it has DHA and EPA both in it as well. So I thought I cracked the code. I thought I figured it out, why fish oil is the go-to. And then now I'm still confused because the algae oil seems to have both of those in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of other things, we live in a system that's all based on shareholder returns, and the stock market, it's a capitalist system. And that's not to diss the capitalist system or anything. That's just the way it works, right? So it's about doing business, and it's about making money, and it's about increasing profits. That's the thing about the system that we're in. We have to increase profits so that we can keep our shareholders of our stocks happy in our companies, so that, our businesses continue to have, good valuations, and, and so it's just the way our system works. But that being said, the food industry, right, it has nothing to do with consumer health or public health. And so just because the food industry, and then of course the food industry has a tremendous influence over the health industry as well. And so it's pretty hard to completely dissociate all of these different entities, because it's messy, and there's a lot of murky water. There's a lot of gray. There's a lot of, lack of transparency in our world. And so, yeah, fish oil has been touted as kind of a miracle drug, or in this case, a miracle nutrient. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it equates with better health or that we can't get these nutrients in other places, right? And just to speak to that more specifically, I have an example of a really good quality systematic review and meta-analysis here that was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And one of them's titled, let me see here, meta-analysis. Yeah, so one of them is omega-3 fatty acid supplementation in cardiovascular disease events. And there's another one, efficacy of omega-3 fatty acid supplements. And yeah, eicosapentaenoic and docosahexaenoic are EPA and DHA. I almost got them right, I think, when I was talking about them earlier.
Impressive, nonetheless, that you could have come close.
I was close. I used to know them by heart, but I haven't said those words in, who knows how many months. So, and the secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. And anyway, what these studies found was that although there's been so many purported benefits, although so many Americans, because of what they hear, go to their doctor and say, hey, doctor, I need to be on fish oil, or even a doctor will recommend, hey, you need to get on a fish oil to help with, your heart. Or even I went to a doctor one time because I was having, joint pain or something, knee pain on my bicycle. And he said, oh, you got to get on a fish oil supplement right away. Like that was going to be some miracle cure for the knee pain that I was suffering, the fish oil. Again, it's like, where's the data on that? But I didn't know any better back then. And so anyway, these studies, what they show in a meta-analysis, what it does is it looks at many studies and it basically brings them all together and it looks at, all the results in these different studies, and then it compounds them. And what it showed was that there was no benefit to both preventing premature death and then preventing the primary events that fish oil is purported to prevent, which are things like, death from cardiovascular disease, so heart attack and stroke, right? So no benefit of taking fish oil supplements, this is specifically fish oil, omega-3 supplementation, for, both lowering your risk for premature death and then cardiovascular events like heart attack and stroke, and there was no benefit. So again, so that's what the science says. But the science, much of the time, what's in the science that isn't translated into the real world, isn't translated into what you and me or what any other average consumer, what they get access to. And so a lot of what people see in terms of fish oil has a lot to do with big business and has little to do with actual verifiable science. It's as simple as that.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. And I also imagine, too, that it's just easier to pull millions of fish out of the sea than to harvest algae oil. It's probably just, from a cost effectiveness and just feasibility standpoint, they could just throw the nets in there and yank all the fish out. It's probably just more effective. So that's why we like to focus on that more.
Yeah, I mean, that may be the case. I mean, or it may be not that it's hard to do algae. It's just, fish just may be the status quo. It's what we're more used to, or there's an existing fish industry. And so fisheries and fishers want to continue to make money. And then the big companies that, the fishermen are probably not making very much money. They're just making a standard wage or just probably just barely getting by in many cases. But the big companies, the food industry, are the ones that are making the big money. And if they already have established established ways of manufacturing and production and of doing all of these things to make fish oil supplement happen, they'd have to do some changes in their whole supply line, in order to shift over to doing algae. And for them, status quo is more easy, because with status quo, again, it all comes back to the bottom line. It's probably what way can you basically extract the most profit with the least amount of effort, the least amount of time, and the least amount of money and resources spent. And so in many cases, it's just going to come down to that, whether or not it has anything to do with what's healthy for the human consumer.
Yeah, well said. So I'm sure, as I've had this question, I'm sure many other people have this question of how much do we need, or how much should we eat? My understanding is there's not a recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, RDI, like we talked about with calcium. So do you have any thoughts on how much we people might want to aim to have each day?
Yeah, the numbers aren't as firm for, let me see, RDA for omega-3. I like you say, for certain nutrients based on, there's just certain nutrients for which we just don't have a good enough understanding of what the human body needs. For many nutrients, we do, like you say, there's something called a recommended dietary allowance. And so for many of the primary nutrients that we know the human body needs in order to basically survive, and then even better to thrive, we have these RDAs. And the RDAs are basically numbers that are going to demonstrate that for a huge preponderance of the population, based on all this, data that we have, that it's going to cover something like, I think it's like 2 standard deviations beyond the mean or something like that, which ends up covering like 97.5 or like 98% or more of the population. We're going to guarantee that if you're getting enough of this, if you're a man, or you're getting enough of this if you're a woman, because our nutrient needs are different between the two sexes, right? That you're going to essentially be pretty darn confident that you're getting enough to sustain good health, right? But for certain nutrients, we don't have enough data to demonstrate that. We do have an RDA for omega-3, and it says for alpha linolenic acid, it's 1.6 grams per day for men and 1.1 grams. Now think about a gram here, right? You need 454 grams in terms of weight to make a pound, 454 grams. And in the case of alpha linolenic acid, we only need 1.6 grams. So we're literally talking about like 1/400th of a pound of this stuff. So it's very minuscule. It's very modest in terms of the amount to get enough ALA per day for men and 1.1 grams per day for women. And so if you convert that, because it's like, well, who cares about that kind of stuff, right? You tell me I need this number of grams of protein or this many milligrams of calcium. These numbers can just get confusing. And so like, what does it mean in terms of whole food? What does this mean in terms of real life, right? And in terms of real life, if you literally get like 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed, again, flaxseed is very rich in those omega-3 precursor, that ALA, alpha linolenic acid. If you get like 1 tablespoon of that, and then you're eating some berries, which have a little bit of ALA, and you're eating some dark leafy greens on a pretty regular basis, which also have some ALA, and you're even going to get a little bit of it in whole grains and, and other foods like that have small amounts of these essential fatty acids, then you're going to guarantee that you're getting enough. Now that's only 1 tablespoon of flax, right? And you don't have to do it with flax. You can do it with a small handful of almonds. I mean, not almonds, specifically walnuts. Walnuts are going to be your greatest source of ALA, specifically the omega-3 precursors in terms of tree nuts, but it's like walnuts are delicious, right? So I just actually today, in terms of a practical use of these foods, right? Smoothie, very easy. Throw, because you're not gonna affect the flavor at all of a smoothie by throwing 1 or 2 tablespoons of ground flaxseed in your smoothie, because you've got the berries and you've got the greens and you've got like your soy milk or your almond milk or whatever, some dates, to sweeten it up. So you've got all these other great foods in there. So you won't even taste it, but then you're going to guarantee you're getting these healthy, this healthy alpha linolenic omega-3 fatty acid in your diet, and you're going to get plenty of it just by throwing a little bit of that in your food. And then what I actually did today was I made a homemade pesto. So I took, and this is super easy for folks, I took a bunch of parsley, right? It's because I don't love the taste of parsley like I do cilantro in terms of like chopping it up and having it fresh. I can stand a little bit of it. But I could throw a massive bunch of it in the Vitamix, or the food processor, any blender, whole bunch of parsley, whole bunch of cilantro, the stems from my favorite kind of kale, lacinato kale, dinosaur kale. I love kale. I actually used the leafy parts the other day in a tempeh stir fry, right? With kale and onion and garlic and ginger, delicious. And then some tempeh, because tempeh is a great source of protein. It comes from soy, of course. But I didn't use the stems because the stems are so hardy and they're kind of woody, they're kind of thick, and they can be hard to they can be so chewy. You just chew on them forever. But I kept the stems, right? Don't get rid of the stems because it's healthy whole plant food, man. We want to be eating as many plants as we possibly can on a daily basis. So don't get rid of those stems. Either use them in a smoothie, because again, you grind them up in a smoothie with some other good things like pineapple, banana, throw some tasty stuff in there. You won't even know they're in there. Or I use those stems in my pesto because I'm going to grind them up in the pesto. It turns into just like a nice kind of a real smooth paste. And so I used the stems from the kale, and then I also used frozen kale, because again, frozen kale, I don't like frozen kale that much in terms of texture compared to fresh kale. But if I'm throwing it in a pesto, I don't even know it was frozen, man. It was so good. So parsley. So again, like 4 different kinds of greens here. I had the stems from lacinato kale. I had green curly kale from the freezer, frozen kale. Great use of frozen kale. Throw it in your pesto. I just, thawed it out in the microwave for a minute before I threw it in there. Parsley, cilantro, and then I used walnuts because, again, the nuts give it the texture. I used pine nuts because pine nuts we know is a classic pesto ingredient. A few walnuts, a few pine nuts. I used some nutritional yeast, some lemon juice to give it the extra flavor, and then just a little dash of olive oil and salt and pepper. And I mean, I'm telling you, that's green gold right there, man. So good. And you've got the dark leafy greens in abundance, right? And I'm not the kind of guy who just like loves eating like huge amounts of green all the time. But you make a pesto like that. And I mean, I'm talking, I had like a couple pounds of greens in this pesto, and you grind it down and you end up putting it on some pasta. And it's this really concentrated source of greens. And because it's been all ground up and it's mixed with the nutritional yeast and the walnuts and the pine nuts, it's so tasty that you're down in greens and you're like, man, eating healthy is easy. And I'm getting all my ALA, my omega-3 precursors.
That is genius. I would have never thought of pesto being such a superfood. Like, that thought's just never crossed my mind. And I'm always thinking of ways to sneak greens in, specifically, any way we can just sneak them in there. And I like what you said about the smoothies and the flaxseed also. I've talked about this before, how I feel the same way about oatmeal or oats, anything oat related that we're eating. Always throw flax in there because nobody will ever know it's there. And that's how the kids are eating their flax and they don't even know. And another pro tip that we talked about, it was a funny little tidbit, was when I accidentally put entirely too much flaxseed in our pancake batter because we used it as the egg replacer. And I had a moment one day where I just put like 4 times as much. And so like every person got a whole tablespoon of flax in their pancakes that day. And it was just funny because it worked. Literally nobody knew the difference. I was like, I'm going to try this. And they might tell me it tastes like cardboard, or they might say it's good. And they said it was good. And so that's another trick you can do too. Just double or triple or maybe even quadruple your flax in your pancake batter and get plenty of it there. So those are really good tips. That's interesting that there is an RDA for ALA. That's really good to know. And I was going to ask you, are there separate RDAs for DHA and EPA, or is it just ALA that we want to get?
I think there is for those, but there may just be, let's see, there is no official recommended dietary allowance or RDA for EPA and DHA. However, most health organizations agree that 250 to 500 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA is enough for adults to maintain their overall health. So again, but that's of course, if you're getting it. Now your body, like we say, is going to convert ALA. And I brought up omega-6 earlier. And I think there's some data to show that if you have a really high amount of omega-6 in your diet, now you're going to get more omega-6 if you're eating lots of processed food. But if you're not eating lots of processed food and you're not eating huge amounts of some of these vegetable oils, and specifically seed oil, so think like cottonseed oil, think safflower, sunflower, what was the other big one? Canola, right? All these different oils come from seeds from plants that are rich in fat. And corn oil even too, right? Corn oil is very popular, just, cooking oil that people use, and it's cheap. So if we're eating tons of these vegetable seed oils, which are rich in omega-6, that the omega-6, then if we get too much omega-6 in our diet, it can kind of compete with the enzymes and the different receptors in the body that help to convert the alpha linolenic acid, the omega-3 precursor, to the long chain EPA and DHA activated forms that help our brain and our cardiovascular health, that can be a potential issue in terms of converting enough ALA to EPA and DHA. But that's just another reason to say, hey, there's nothing wrong with eating a little bit of vegetable oil, whether it's coming from seeds, whether it's coming from, things like, olive oil. But we just want to keep those things low. We want to keep those things modest because, again, oil is a highly processed food. We're taking a whole plant food like an olive. or we're taking a whole seed from some of these seed oils and we're pressing it. And sometimes we're often adding heat and other ingredients to these whole plant foods to extract only the fat. We're only extracting the oil from these whole plant foods. And then of course it's a great way to add flavor, to add texture, to add mouthfeel to the foods that we cook, especially if we're making fried food, you have to have oil. Well, you can use, at least in the case of, now we have the, what are the fryers? The air fryers. So you can air fry things. So that's another potential option. But nonetheless, historically, and for the most part, whenever you go to a restaurant or everything, they're not air frying. They're going to be deep fat frying in one of these types of oils. And so ideally, we're not eating fried food, or if we are, it's as far and few between as possible, because we know beyond the shadow of a doubt, the more fried food you eat, it just increases your risk for gaining unwanted weight and body fat, increases your risk for heart disease and stroke, things like this. So we don't want to be eating a lot of fried food. It's not good for our cardiovascular health. But also when it comes to the conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA, we just want to avoid eating high amounts, I think, of a lot of these, different types of oils. And again, it's just another reason to choose more whole plant foods and choose less oils and other types of processed foods. Any type of, the more processed it is, generally speaking, now that this isn't in all cases, not all forms of processing are bad, right? We have to process whole grains to a certain degree just to get them out of the, the hulls that they have, in order to make them edible, right? So some processing is good. Canning certain things if we're not adding extra salt, or freezing vegetables, blanching them and then freezing them when they're at peak ripeness. We lock in most all of the nutrients. Some of those frozen vegetables and fruits can be even more nutrient dense than a lot of the fresh stuff that we see at the grocery store, because that fresh stuff has often been sitting around for weeks, if not months, refrigerated at cold temperatures to keep it from going bad, and with different gas, and different types of gaseous environments in order to keep them from going bad. And so those things are losing nutrients over time as well, even if they're quote unquote fresh, right? And so not all forms of processing are bad, but generally speaking, whenever we're adding ingredients in processing, that tends to reduce health quality. That means like adding lots of extra salt, oil, or sugar to food during processing. That's generally going to make things worse for our health. Or when we take things away during processing, so we can add things that are harmful, or we can take things away that are good for us. So take grains, for example. White flour is a perfect example. We take away 2 of the 3 parts of the grain. The grain's made up of the endosperm, which is like the starchy part where we get most of the carbohydrate, most of the calories from it. And then we've got the germ and we've got the bran. And you lose the germ, which is full of all these beneficial like B vitamins and essential fatty acids. And we lose the bran, which has all the fiber in it, when we process grains and we turn them into white flour or white rice. And so again, some processing bad, and generally speaking, the less processed food, the better when it comes to getting the right kinds of nutrients and making sure that we're taking care of our overall health.
Yeah. And with all that said, like you say, some processing is good. I think it's a friendly reminder with flaxseed, you do want ground flaxseed, right? As opposed to the whole flaxseed. That way you know that your body can absorb it. And so just going back to how much we need, how much we want to aim for, like you say, you take a supplement just to be safe. And I like to also, just like as the insurance policy, if you will. But I sort of went down a rabbit hole when I looked at that 250 to 500 milligrams of combined DHA and EPA. And I looked at, well, let's say my body was just really terrible at converting to ALA, right? And so let's say it only converted 5% of what I was eating, or 10% of the ALA. It only converted 5 to 10% of that. And I crunched some numbers and looked at, foods that I eat, how much ALA they have in them. And I found that I would still meet that pretty much on a daily basis, even if my body were really terrible at converting it. And I just found that interesting, because it's sort of what you always say, like what you said about protein, what you said about calcium. It's kind of what you always say. If you eat a wide variety of whole foods and you get enough calories, you don't have to worry about the reductionism. You don't have to go there and worry about it so much. And so I just thought that was interesting.
No, that's cool to know, man. Like you say, I think there's some numbers out there that to some degree, again, like I said earlier, there's more data that we need to see whether or not it's a really good idea for everybody to supplement some EPA and DHA to make sure we're getting enough of those activated long chain omega-3 fatty acids, and that, we're not asking too much of our bodies to convert ALA to EPA and DHA, and make sure that we're getting enough of it to kind of optimize our brain and our cardiovascular health. We need more data, to a certain degree. But that being said, like you say, even if we're inefficient, if we're getting lots of different varieties, so think of all the different types of whole plant foods here. Fruits and veg are the obvious two, right? Then throw on legumes, which we put beans, split peas, chickpeas, and any kind of lentils into legumes. Whole intact grains, mushrooms, which are a separate category because it's fungus, it's not plants, but we usually lump them in with vegetables. But mushrooms are wonderfully beneficial for our health. Most types, though, we want to make sure to cook to make the nutrients kind of bioavailable for absorption. In mushrooms, we want to make sure to cook them. Whereas most fruits and veg, you can eat raw without cooking. And we should definitely be getting a mixture of some cooked is great, but getting some raw is also really good too. So getting a mixture of the two is really awesome. And then, so we've got fruit and veg, we've got legumes, we've got whole grains, we've got mushrooms, then we've got nuts and seeds. And again, nuts and seeds tend to be really rich in some of these healthy fats, monounsaturated, but also polyunsaturated. And that's something that I didn't mention specifically earlier, but the ALA, or the omega-3s and the omega-6s, are polyunsaturated fatty acids. So people will hear the term saturated, they'll hear the term monounsaturated, and they'll hear the term polyunsaturated. And generally speaking, there's a lot of data to show that consuming more polyunsaturated fat is good for our health. But we want to do it to the greater extent possible. We get a lot of polyunsaturated fat from some of these plant-based oils, nut and seed oils and different things, and olive oil, but the safest and healthiest sources are always going to be whole plant foods. So the nuts and seeds themselves, not the oils that come from them through processing. And then finally, herbs and spices, because herbs and spices come from whole plant foods. They're usually just ground, forms of the roots or the seeds or the different parts of whole plant foods that we find, that are growing in nature, right? So those kind of, what is that? That's like 4 plus mushrooms, plus nuts and seeds, plus herbs and spices. That's like 9 different things, 9 different categories, more or less, of whole plant foods. And again, not to stress people out, but it's like the more diversity that we can get into our diets, the better when it comes to meeting all of our nutrient needs. And then when it comes to optimizing our health, there's this great project called the American Gut Project, which I talk about all the time, where they actually have taken stool, which are our feces. They've taken stool samples from literally tens of thousands of people, and they look at, of course, the stool contains, just millions of bacteria, different kinds of bacteria that live in our large intestine. And the majority of the weight of our stool, people may be surprised to hear this. Sorry, we're getting into stool, but a stool is a big part of our health. What comes in one end must come out the other, my brother. And so, but the majority of the weight of our stool, isn't the food that's going through, because we're breaking down and we're absorbing a lot of those nutrients and a lot of that weight. And of course, a lot of the weight in terms of the food that's coming in is mostly water weight, right? Vegetables, like on average, like 90%, 80 some 90% water, and fruits are way up there too. And even whole grains, which you wouldn't think of as being as watery as something like a fruit or a veg, are like 70% water by weight. So most of all that is going to be absorbed, and then we're going to use what we need and sweat out some, and then pee out some of the rest that we don't need. But anyway, most of that stool weight is actually bacteria. It's the bacteria, because the bacteria are eating all this wonderful fiber. If we're on a plant-based diet and we're getting lots of fiber, especially whole food plant-based diet, ideally getting lots of fiber, that fiber makes it down undigested, because we as humans cannot break down fiber, can't digest it. So it makes it down to our large intestine after it goes through our small intestine, right, where a lot of that breakdown and a lot of the absorption of many nutrients takes place, gets down to the large intestine, and that's where our bacteria reside, our microbiome, and they start going crazy eating all those different types of fiber. Well, just like us, right, bacteria are picky. So different species of bacteria, only want to eat certain types of fiber. They come from certain plant foods, and every plant, even though there's like 2 umbrella classifications for fiber, which are the soluble and the insoluble fiber. But even though we have those 2 general umbrella classifications, there's literally hundreds or even thousands of different very subtle variations in terms of the different kinds of insoluble and soluble fiber that come in whole plant foods, right? Because all these foods, just like us as people, they look very unique and very different and very diverse. And so the fiber that makes up those plants has variations in it. And the bacteria that live in our gut like different types of fiber. And so the more different kinds of diversity that we have in terms of the whole plant foods that we're consuming. So that's why I named all 9 categories of those whole plant foods that we want to be getting into our diet. We're going to get more and more diversity in our gut. And the more diverse our microbiome is, so the more different kinds of species that we have living in abundance inside of our large intestine, time and time again shows that it benefits overall health. Less risk for overweight and obesity, less risk for type 2 diabetes, less risk for premature death, right? Less risk for colon cancer, and the list goes on and on. And so again, another great reason to eat more plant foods, more whole plant foods. And then in the process, like you say, we're going to be getting great amounts of ALA, and we're not going to be getting too much of the things that we don't want, whether it's too much omega-6 fatty acid, which is the other form of polyunsaturated fat, or whether it's some of the other stuff like saturated fat that we really want to make sure to minimize in our diet.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, about the variety, because a lot of times too, people will we get in our comfort zones, right? We hear like, oh, Gabrielle said walnuts are a good source of omega-3, so I'm going to eat walnuts every single day, a handful of walnuts, and that's my go-to. And I'm not going to eat pistachios or pecans or all these other great nuts and seeds, and we want to vary it, right? And I feel like, again, it's another story of the protein, because with all these different nutrients, people think of certain things that are a source of those, and then we think nothing else has those. Like with protein, they think, okay, if I'm going to be vegan, then I have to eat soy or beans or nuts, or I'm not going to get protein. But if you eat carrots and bananas and kale, all these things have much smaller amounts of protein, but combined, you're going to get some protein from them when you're getting enough calories, right? And I feel like it's the same thing with omega-3s, because when I went down the rabbit hole again, I looked at, well, pecans are my favorite nuts. Do pecans have omega-3s? Yes, they do. And there's so many other foods that I never thought of, because we always talk about the prime sources, which have the highest amounts, like walnuts and flaxseed and chia seeds and so forth. But then I found beans actually have some omega-3s in small amounts, and soy has omega-3s in small amounts. So my soy milk that I love so much. And so I'm feeling like, again, if you just add it all up in small amounts throughout the day, you don't have to have your go-to chia every single day or walnuts every single day. As good as those are, we should have those with a variety of other things too.
Brilliant point, Tony. Yeah, like in the bottom level of my fridge here, I've got my nuts and seeds, and so I try to have as much diversity as possible. So today in my pesto, like I mentioned, I threw pine nuts. I didn't mention I also threw pistachios along with the walnuts, right? And so yeah, I'll throw those I'll just usually do 1 or 2 or 3 different kinds of nuts just to vary it up and to have more diversity again in there, because it's as easy as a shake into the blender, and then I mix it up for 2 or 3 minutes, and it's done. And so again, easy ways to incorporate more different kinds of plants into our diet. But I'll never do two or 3 times in a row. I'll never do the same nuts or seeds. Next time I'll do sunflower and pumpkin seeds and maybe some pine nuts, right? Or just sunflower seeds, or just sunflower and pumpkin seeds. Or I've done pecans, like you say, I love pecans too. I've done pecans and say cashews, another nut that I love. And so there's just with pesto, people would think historically, right? Pesto has traditionally been made with pine nuts. That's it. The pine nut is like the nut of pesto, but you're limiting yourself if you're just going to be locked into using pine nuts every time, when I literally will go through like 8 or 10 different kinds of nuts and seeds just by making that one food of a pesto. Such an easy way to have diversity. So I've incorporated, and again, American Gut Project I mentioned, what they show with all the data from like thousands of different people from whom they've collected stool samples, and then they've analyzed all these different biomarkers that relate to their health, their blood pressure, their blood sugar, their overall weight, whether or not they've had a heart attack, all these different things. What they've shown is that if we can get at least 30 different plants into our diets each week, that's a good minimum, good starting point. And that may seem like a lot, but like I said, if I make one pesto, I have 3 or 4 kinds of nuts. I can just put that right in one pesto. That's 3 or 4 different kind of foods. Boom, and then I had 3 or 4 different kinds of greens in that one pesto, plus nutritional yeast, plus, so it's like all of a sudden I've got like 8 or 10 different kinds of foods in one pesto. Boom. And so it's like 30 in a week. In one food, I threw down 6 or 8 or 9 different kinds of whole plant foods in one pesto. So we can easily get to 30. Think about making a salad. You can easily have 4, 5, 6 ingredients in one salad just by having some tomatoes, some carrots, some red cabbage, some type of greens, some nuts and seeds on the salad. Think about throwing fruit into your salad, because strawberries, because blueberries, because thinly sliced apples. These things are all delicious in salad. And all of a sudden you've got 6, 8, 10 ingredients in one salad. So we can easily get to 30. And then of course, but then what their data showed is 30 is a good minimum, but ideally we're getting 40 different types of whole plant foods into our diets each week over the course of a week. I believe it was a week. It might've been 2 weeks, but I'm almost positive it was a week. But nonetheless, just rest assured, the more plants you can get in, the better, but do not fear. We don't have to go from 0 to hero. If you're just starting out on this journey, or if you have a very simple diet right now and you don't have a lot of diversity, don't stress. Don't think about having to do all these advanced salads or all these crazy pestos like I'm talking about. If that's stressful, just start from square one. Start with oatmeal, with flaxseed, with some berries, and do that for a few weeks. And once you get that down and that's super easy, then you can find a new little step to tackle, right? So yeah, go slow and take it easy. And don't stress about it, because if you just make some small steps, before you know it, you'll get more and more plants into your diet. And that's going to have a huge impact on your overall health. And like we said, getting more plants, more whole foods, and lots of variety is going to be way more important than worrying about individual amounts of, I got to get this much protein, I got to get this much calcium, I got to get this much, omega-3. Let's worry more about getting more whole plant foods. And I guarantee that will do so much more for your overall health than worrying about individual nutrients.
Perfect. So well said. Thank you so much. And I'm fascinated by that. I think I'm going to count how many plants I eat this week and see what my number is. And I'm going to report back, because I'm really interested. I'm going to look into that, and maybe we can talk about that more in the future in the podcast. Cause I think,
30 to 40 per week, man, as a good kind of like, gold standard. Go beyond that. Hey man, sky's the limit.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation, and hopefully we answered everyone's questions about omega-3s. If you have more, please reach out, and we'd love to do some, Q&A if there's a lot more questions left, or revisit the conversation. But as always, thank you for joining us. Gabrielle, thank you for being here, and we will see you all next time. Thanks for joining us. We release new episodes every 2 weeks. You can always email us at plantbased@apnm.org. Check out our website, apnm.org/plantbased, for classes, recipes, and more resources.
See you in 2 weeks.